Empires usually fall in noise. Cannons thunder, armies march, capitals burn. History teaches us to expect collapse to arrive, wrapped in violence and spectacle. But in the 19th century, one of the largest empires on earth was dismantled without a single foreign flag raised over its palaces. No triumphant invasion, no parade through its capital. The Ottoman Empire did not fall to gunpowder. It fell to arithmetic. This is the story of how an empire was quietly conquered by ledgers, contracts, and interest schedules. It is the story of the first fully modern debt trap, a financial weapon so effective that it would later be deployed across continents. And it reveals a brutal truth of geopolitics that still governs the modern world. You do not need to invade a nation to control it. You only need to own its debt. In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still looked formidable on a map. It stretched from the Balkans, deep into Europe, across Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across much of North Africa. From Istanbul, the Sultan ruled over millions and commanded some of the most strategic trade routes on earth. To outside observers, the empire appeared ancient, resilient, and powerful. But beneath the ceremonial splendor, decay had already set in. While Britain and France were transforming themselves through industrialization, building factories, railways, and steam-powered economies, the Ottoman system remained largely agrarian. Its economy relied on peasants, small artisans, and manual production in a world that was rapidly being dominated by machines. Ottoman farmers were suddenly forced to compete with cheap, mass-produced European goods flooding their markets. They could not win. The state finances reflected this imbalance. Tax collection was inefficient and deeply corrupt. Revenue passed through layers of intermediaries who siphoned off wealth long before it reached the imperial treasury. Cash shortages were constant. For centuries, Ottoman rulers had survived fiscal crises using medieval solutions, debasing the currency, confiscating elite wealth, or simply delaying payments. But the global economy had changed. These old tricks no longer worked. The empire needed capital. Not luxury, but survival capital. It needed a modern army to deter Russia, infrastructure to govern its vast territories, and the appearance of a civilized European power to maintain diplomatic relevance. Yet for decades, Ottoman rulers resisted borrowing from Western banks. There was a cultural and religious aversion to usury and a political fear of dependence on Christian powers. That resistance collapsed in 1853. When Russia invaded Ottoman territory, igniting the Crimean War, the conflict became existential. Britain and France intervened militarily to block Russian expansion. But they brought something far more dangerous than soldiers. They brought bankers. War is expensive, and the Ottoman treasury was unprepared. Soldiers required wages, weapons required manufacturing, ships required supplies. Gold drained from the state at a terrifying pace. Sultan Abdülmecid faced a choice between financial taboo and imperial collapse. In 1854, the empire signed its first foreign loan with a syndicate of British and French banks. It was presented as Allied assistance. In reality, it was the first shackle. The loan terms were brutal. Ottoman bonds were issued at a deep discount. For every 100 units of debt the empire signed, it received only around 80 in cash. The banks kept the difference as commission and risk protection. Yet interest was charged on the full amount. The Ottomans were paying interest on money they had never received. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance: high effective interest, reduced cash flow, long-term obligations growing faster than state revenue. But at first, the effects felt miraculous. The army was paid, the crisis eased, Russia was defeated, the empire survived, and the Sultan learned a dangerous lesson. With a signature in London or Paris, gold could appear instantly. When the war ended in 1856, the borrowing did not. Ottoman elites had tasted easy credit and became addicted. They looked at Europe's glittering capitals and felt inferior. They wanted Istanbul to rival Paris and London. They wanted to prove the empire was modern. But instead of investing in productive capacity, factories, education, irrigation, they spent on prestige. The most infamous symbol of this vanity was Dolmabahce Palace. Abandoning the traditional Topkapi Palace as outdated, Sultan Abdülmecid ordered a new residence on the Bosphorus that would rival Versailles. Dolmabahce was an architectural masterpiece. Gold leaf, imported marble, crystal staircases, and the largest chandelier in the world. It was breathtaking. It was also a financial tombstone. The palace was built entirely with borrowed money. Its cost equaled roughly a quarter of the empire's annual tax revenue. While Anatolian peasants struggled with wooden plows, the state imported European luxury it could not afford. To fund this extravagance, the empire returned again and again to Western banks. Each loan came with worse terms. Each agreement deepened dependence. By the 1860s, Ottoman finances resembled a slow-moving financial collapse. New loans were required simply to service old ones. Debt payments exploded. In 1860, around 15% of state revenue went to debt service. By 1870, it exceeded 50%. Half of all taxes collected from farmers, fishermen, and merchants were transferred abroad to bondholders in London and Paris. The empire was being hollowed out from within. What still looked sovereign on the surface was already compromised at its core. The Ottoman state was no longer governing. It was servicing debt, and it had only just begun to understand the true cost of borrowing survival. By the early 1870s, the Ottoman Empire was no longer merely indebted. It was structurally trapped. Debt had ceased to be an emergency tool and had become the operating system of the state. The empire no longer borrowed to grow or modernize. It borrowed to exist. Each new loan was not investment, but oxygen. And every breath made the dependency deeper. More than half of all state revenue now vanished abroad before it could fund an army, build a road, or educate a child. The empire still looked alive, but its organs were failing. To keep the machine running between major European loans, the government increasingly relied on the Galata bankers, a network of local financiers based in Istanbul. These lenders provided short-term advances at catastrophic interest rates, sometimes exceeding 20%. These were not development loans. They were emergency infusions used to pay salaries, calm unrest, or bridge gaps until the next foreign bond issue. Each loan solved today's problem by multiplying tomorrow's catastrophe. When Sultan Abdulaziz ascended the throne, the pattern intensified. Abdulaziz was obsessed with prestige and military power. He believed that a modern navy would restore Ottoman authority and command European respect. So he ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards and advanced artillery from Germany. On paper, the Ottoman navy became one of the largest in the world. In reality, it was a fleet of floating debt. There was no money to fuel the ships, no coal to operate them, no maintenance budget to keep them seaworthy. Many never left harbor. They rusted in the Golden Horn, monuments to borrowed ambition. The empire had acquired the appearance of power without the capacity to sustain it. Then the illusion collapsed. In 1873, a financial panic erupted in Vienna and spread across Europe, triggering a global downturn known as the Long Depression. Capital markets froze. European banks, suddenly short of liquidity, stopped lending. The music stopped. At the same moment, disaster struck the Ottoman heartland. Severe drought hit Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed. Livestock died. Famine spread. The peasantry, which formed the tax base of the empire, had nothing left to give. Revenue collapsed just as debt payments came due. By the summer of 1875, the situation was terminal. The treasury was empty. A massive interest payment to European bondholders loomed in October. Attempts to raise a new loan failed. Markets were closed. The empire faced an impossible choice: starve its population to pay foreign creditors, or stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Ramadan. It announced that debt payments would be cut in half. 50% would be paid in cash. The remainder would be paid in paper promises. In diplomatic language, it was a moratorium. In financial reality, it was a default. The reaction in Europe was explosive. Ottoman bonds were widely held by middle-class investors in Britain and France. Teachers, clerks, shopkeepers, people who had been told these bonds were safe, saw their savings evaporate. Newspapers erupted with rage. The Ottomans were denounced as thieves and barbarians. Political sympathy vanished overnight. Financial default translated instantly into diplomatic isolation. Weakness invites aggression. In 1877, Russia seized the moment. Seeing the empire bankrupt, isolated, and militarily strained, it declared war. The Russo-Turkish War was catastrophic. Ottoman soldiers fought bravely, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. Russian forces advanced deep into Ottoman territory, reaching the outskirts of Istanbul itself. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, surrendering large portions of the Balkans and the Caucasus. Worse still was the financial clause. Russia imposed a massive war indemnity, demanding hundreds of millions in compensation. Now the empire faced impossible arithmetic. It had defaulted on Western debt, lost territory, and now owed a crushing sum to Russia. The total debt burden exceeded the productive capacity of the entire economy. Insolvency was absolute. Sultan Abdulhamid II inherited a corpse. He ruled a state that had lost credit, land, and independence. But instead of carving up the empire militarily, the European powers chose a more efficient method. Territorial occupation was expensive and politically risky. Financial control was cleaner, profitable, and permanent. They would conquer the empire without armies. In 1881, the final transformation was formalized. European power no longer needed armies, advisors, or colonial administrators to dominate the Ottoman Empire. It only needed accountants. That year, representatives of European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They did not wear uniforms. They carried no flags. They arrived quietly, armed only with contracts written in foreign languages, and backed by financial markets the empire could no longer access. The negotiations that followed produced a document that would quietly end Ottoman economic sovereignty: the Decree of Muharrem. This decree created an institution unlike anything the world had seen before: the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. known as the OPDA, was not an Ottoman agency. It was not a foreign government. It was a multinational financial authority governed by representatives of British, French, German, Italian, and Austrian banks. Its mandate was simple and absolute: secure repayment. Under the decree, the empire surrendered direct control over its most reliable sources of revenue. Taxes on salt, tobacco, silk, fishing, spirits, and stamp duties were transferred directly to the OPDA. These revenues no longer passed through the Sultan's treasury. They were collected, recorded, and exported by an institution that answered only to creditors. From that moment on, sovereignty became ceremonial. The Sultan still ruled in name, decrees were still issued, ministers still debated policy, but the lifeblood of the state flowed elsewhere. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy, employed thousands of officials, and operated independently of Ottoman authority. It even maintained armed tax collectors to enforce compliance. A state within a state had been born, and it was more efficient than the one it replaced. Ironically, the OPDA worked better than the Ottoman fiscal system ever had. Records were standardized, warehouses were built, collections were enforced with European discipline, revenues stabilized and grew. But none of this wealth belonged to the Ottoman people. It was extracted and transferred abroad. By the late 19th century, roughly 1/3 of all Ottoman state revenue vanished into European vaults every year before the government could fund schools, roads, or industry. Modernization became impossible by design. Any attempt to invest in domestic development was blocked by pre-existing debt obligations. Surplus capital did not belong to the empire. It belonged to creditors. Roads required approval. Ports required approval. Railways required approval. Even military expenditures were constrained by debt schedules written decades earlier. The empire still existed, but it no longer controlled its future. It was managed. This invisible conquest reshaped geopolitics. While Britain and France were satisfied extracting steady revenue, another power saw opportunity in the Ottoman weakness. Germany had arrived late to imperial competition. It lacked colonies and global reach, but it possessed industry, ambition, and strategic vision. German leaders viewed the Ottoman Empire not merely as a debtor, but as a geopolitical hinge connecting Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The German Kaiser personally courted the Sultan. He framed Britain and France as parasites draining the empire dry and presented Germany as a partner offering development rather than exploitation. And then came the proposal that shifted the balance of power, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. The railway promised to connect Central Europe to the Persian Gulf, bypassing British-controlled sea routes and the Suez Canal. For the Ottomans, it appeared to offer escape. Railways meant troop mobility, economic integration, and the possibility of genuine modernization. It was a chance to convert dependency into productivity, but the chains simply changed hands. The Ottoman treasury remained empty and under OPDA supervision. Britain and France refused to finance a project that threatened their strategic interests. Germany stepped in. Deutsche Bank offered funding, but the contracts guaranteed profits to German companies regardless of actual usage. If traffic was low, the Ottoman state paid the difference. Worse still, German firms were granted rights to minerals and oil discovered along the railway corridor. Economic sovereignty was not restored, it was transferred. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had shifted from Anglo-French financial domination to German economic dependency. German officers reorganized the army. German engineers ran infrastructure. German banks held the new debt. What had begun as a financial arrangement had evolved into a strategic alignment. Britain and France watched with growing alarm. When World War I erupted in 1914, Ottoman leaders faced a final calculation. They understood the truth they had lived under for decades. As long as the debt system existed, the empire could never be sovereign. As long as the OPDA controlled revenue, reform was impossible. Germany offered a gamble. Victory could erase debts. Defeat would mean destruction. Slow death was already guaranteed, so they chose risk. One of the empire's first acts upon entering the war was symbolic and defiant. British and French officials were expelled from OPDA headquarters in Istanbul. Debt payments were halted. For the first time in decades, the empire experienced the illusion of autonomy. But illusions do not win wars. The conflict was catastrophic. Invasion, famine, rebellion, and collapse tore the empire apart. By the time the war ended, the Ottoman state no longer existed. Its territory was partitioned, its institutions dissolved, but the debt survived. When the Turkish Republic emerged under Mustafa Kemal after a brutal war of independence, the creditors returned, not with armies, with ledgers. Their argument was simple and ruthless. You inherited the land, you inherit the mortgage. The new republic needed recognition, trade, and access to global markets. It accepted the obligation. The debt was restructured, not erased. For decades, a nation born from revolution sent scarce resources abroad to repay loans signed by long-dead sultans. The final payment closed the account, but the lesson endured. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because it lacked courage, culture, or history. It fell because it lost control of its revenue. Wars, revolts, and fragmentation were symptoms, not causes. The fatal blow had been delivered quietly through contracts, interest schedules, and institutions designed for extraction without responsibility. Empires do not always collapse in flames. Some are foreclosed. The Ottoman debt trap created a template that would be repeated across the 20th century. Different flags, different languages, same mechanism, debt replaced conquest, interest replaced invasion. Financial supervision replaced colonial governors. Policy became conditional. Development delayed. Sovereignty negotiated. The Ottomans believed they were borrowing to modernize. In reality, they were borrowing away their future. Money was never neutral. It always carried power attached.